Eurostars, KO in particular Eurostars. It's been a while. So it's time to kick off Unit 2 with yet another Siegcast. This one is going to be on the Reformation. In particular, we're going to be talking about this guy, Martin Luther, and how he changed the world in terms of religion, but this was not just a religious revolution, it was also a social, political, and socioeconomic revolution as well. And by the end of this, you'll be able to explain that. So anyway, I just want to remind you that our objective here, as always, is to dominate May 8th. And that's exactly what I expect you guys to do. So let's talk about Martin Luther, who he was, his background, that type of thing. So Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk who had taught at the University of Wittenberg. And, there's a lot to his story. In fact, he's supposed to be a lawyer at one point, didn't necessarily want to be a lawyer. He was always attracted to religion, really struggled with the idea of being saved. And, no matter how much he followed Catholic doctrine, he really never felt like he was guaranteed salvation. And I know that sounds pretty deep, but remember, you got to think about where he lived, and you got to think about the context of the time that he lived. And these were things that he was very astute at. The other thing, he was a deep thinker. He was a theologian. His legal training, had kind of trained him to really want to be able to find this stuff out, research it, and have proof. Just like I try to teach you with our FRQs and DBQs. Show me the proof, and that's what he was trying to do. So, anyway, as the story goes, he was walking home from college one day, and he was caught in just a horrific thunderstorm, and lightning was hitting all around him. And he promised that if God got him through this lightning storm and this thunderstorm alive, that he would become a monk. And I know we've probably all had those experiences where we make promises, and man, if we just do this, I'll do this, I promise, I'll never do this again. Let's face it, how many of us have ever followed through on those things? But my man Martin Luther followed through, much to his dad's chagrin, and was very upset with him. And he became a monk, and he rose through the ranks. He was very intelligent. Anyway, he taught at the University of Wittenberg. And, the other influences besides salvation and a thunderstorm that influenced him, there was a gentleman named Johann Tetzel that you need to know. And Johann Tetzel was authorized by Pope Leo X to sell indulgences. Now, some of you guys know what these are, but indulgences were really payments that would reduce perhaps a person's punishment in purgatory. Now, again, purgatory is that in-between stage. You're not in heaven, you're not in hell, you're kind of waiting. And these are the people that haunt, and depending on what your belief is, some denominations of Christianity don't believe in this as something that exists, and others do. But the papacy would sell these things, or it also could be bought to perhaps reduce the pain of a loved one who had already died and get them into heaven. And, the problem is these were initially kind of sold to comfort people. But what ended up happening was the Pope was looking for additional revenue here. And again, we're talking about Leo X, to pay for building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the one that we talked about with Michelangelo. So they basically started hawking these things and selling these things. And in fact, Tetzel had a slogan: as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And it really kind of made a mockery of of what the intentions of indulgences were. And Luther had a problem with it. This is something you'll see on the test. This is a picture of the time, and again, it's in German here. But again, it's as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And this is people putting money into the chest, and springing. You got a dove up here going to heaven, and this is Johann Tetzel. I may show you a movie in class that kind of depicts this, or at least upload it to YouTube or the class website. So, the significance of what indulgences did, it kind of made Martin Luther have one of those, I like to say it, a Jerry Maguire moment. And again, I know I'm older than a lot of you, and you probably have never seen Jerry Maguire, but in the movie, Jerry Maguire, kind of has this this moral epiphany, and he writes this long letter, to his bosses and to everyone in the company, and basically saying that they're doing it all wrong, that it's about the person. And if you've seen the movie, Jerry Maguire gets awarded with being fired. But anyway, this is kind of what Martin Luther does here. He writes this 95 thesis, his 95 ideas, and basically it's gripes, it's criticism. He criticizes the selling of indulgences, but went further than others before him by actually questioning the scriptural authority of the Pope to grant indulgences. Now, there's some discrepancy. The old adage goes that Luther actually nailed the 95 thesis to the church door in Wittenberg. Some people say that no, he didn't do that. He sent it to his resident bishop instead. And this is a matter of historical dispute. Some people say that he really didn't intend everybody to read these. It wasn't until later somebody got a hold of them and put them on the printing press that facilitated the spread of Luther's work with astonishing speed. You do need to know that, the influence of the printing press here. So, let's not forget, it just wasn't indulgences. This had been something that had been brewing for hundreds of years. We've learned about John Wycliffe. We've learned about the complaints of John Huss. We've talked about the Lollards. We've talked about simony, selling of church offices to multiple people. We've talked about pluralism. We've talked about or you've read about the Babylonian captivity, the Great Schism. All of these things had been bottled up. And, again, with humanism of Erasmus and Sir Thomas More and just that trend in education, something was going to give. And this is kind of what Luther was doing when he brought these things to write. So really what this does was it starts a showdown between Luther and the Catholic Church. And, again, the big thing that Luther did was he challenged the church authority. Initially, the Pope viewed the issue of the 95 Thesis as a disagreement between Augustinian and Dominican monks. Not a big deal. Theological debates among clergy members was not unprecedented. It goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. But in 1518, Luther defied the Pope by refusing to stop his crusade. He was just said, they said stop, and he refused to. He was stubborn. He was a stubborn German, just like myself. So we need to know who this guy is, but he was protected by a guy. The thing that made him different, John Huss, who got executed, was he had help. He had political help, and his political help was by the elector Frederick III, Frederick the Wise of Saxony. And because he had, and I'll talk about him in a second, because he had backup at this point, Luther didn't seek to create a new church, but rather he wanted to reform the Catholic Church, but that's going to change. So who was Frederick the Wise? We've talked about the Golden Bull, 1356, and we've talked about the situation in the new monarchs. If you remember, we talked about Charles V wasn't, really a typical new monarch, because in the Holy Roman Empire, you had electors who actually did have a say of who the Holy Roman Emperor was, and kind of had a little bit of authority or autonomy, if you will, against the Holy Roman Emperor. So, a lot of these people were looking to step up and stand up to Charles V. Why? Well, Charles V was, he was Spanish, he was brought up in the Netherlands, and tended to look down on Germans. And a lot of the people in Germany didn't appreciate this. So this was an opportunity for Frederick the Wise of Saxony to kind of make a stand and have, basically some German nationalism, if you will. So, the debate between John Eck, one of the great theologians, Luther loved debate. He was a bully when it came to debating. We'll actually do one of these debates in class and do a little bit of role playing. But he debated Johann or John Eck in Leipzig in 1520. And Luther denied the infallibility of the Pope and the infallibility of a general council. Basically said the Pope isn't the guy in charge, a general council isn't in charge, that it's the scripture. And Luther claimed that the church had erred when it executed John Huss for heresy. And this was the point of no return for Luther. He starts calling out the authorities. And in 1520, there's a live action footage of Luther debating John Eck. And it was intense, as you can get a feel for that last slide. I'm sure you guys are like trembling right now. But in terms of the tenets of Luther's reforms, in 1520, Luther published his theology of reform, and basically said that salvation could be achieved through faith and faith alone. He rejected good works as a means to salvation, but believed that good works followed faith. And again, what are good works? A lot of you guys know this. Good works is following all the sacraments. Good works is doing helping alms, and what I mean by that is helping out with the poor. And he basically said that stuff that the Catholic Church promises does not guarantee salvation. He says that the Bible is the sole authority, and somebody in the church council or a priest can't guarantee you salvation. Another thing that he did was pretty intense, was he only kept 2 sacraments. He said the only sacraments that you need are baptism and communion. Those are the only ones that are valid. And I don't need to go into all of the sacraments of the Catholic Church, including marriage, including what the heck, penance, which is confession, the last rites. Basically in doing this, what you need to associate why this is so significant, he's basically taking power away from the priest. He said it's not about the priest, it's about the believer. Okay? And again, I'm not preaching to you, I'm just preaching to you what he said. And where he got his theology here was from Scripture, Romans 1:17. And Luther combed over the Bible looking for the answer. And this is where he thought he found the answer, where it says, the righteous shall live by faith. And that's the major tenet of his reform. He says that Luther realizes that only faith in the ultimate goodness of Jesus, not good deeds, could save a person. No good works, rituals, or anything that the priest does or says. It's a person's faith. That is what saves human beings from salvation, and that is basically grace, justification by faith, and through God's grace, he gives people salvation. And this kind of unleashes something that John Huss had started earlier, which is a priesthood of all believers. It's not the hierarchy of the church. He says Christians were not subject to the Pope's interpretation of the Bible, that people can read the Bible and think for themselves. There's humanism at work, boys and girls. The Bible contained all that was needed for a person to lead a church or a Christian life, and a church of hierarchy and bishops and priests, therefore, you didn't need it. So, again, he reaffirmed this by criticizing further the indulgences and simony. He encouraged German princes to reform the church in their states. So this is a green light now. Charles V worked closely with the Pope. Now he's encouraging German princes like Frederick the Wise of Saxony to take the matters into their own hand and reform the church in their states. And they got caught up in this. So you have politics here. You have nationalism. This is not just a religious movement. It's all these things. And if you think about it, people are paying buku taxes to the Catholic Church. So if German princes could reform the church in their states, now they could kind of cut off the taxes that were going to the Roman Catholic Church, and they could now collect taxes for themselves. Sorry, I lost my place. Sometimes when I do these things at school, people come in unannounced, which is fine. But, basically going in here, I was talking about politics and all those things. So he rejected the Catholic monastic tenets of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we'll see this. This is one thing that he changes. And he says that it's okay for the priest to marry. And yes, your boy Martin Luther will marry, baby. He's going to marry a nun. Stay tuned. Yeah, sassy. Anyway, why was Luther excommunicated? Why do you suppose it didn't work? There's a couple things. He was excommunicated by Pope Leo X in 1520. And Luther threw the papal bull, which excommunicated him, into a fire. And here's live footage of that, making kind of a big scene. And, this was propaganda that was spread all throughout Germany, and it was something that the Germans loved because the Germans were constantly looked down upon by the Spanish, by all the powers that be. We're going to talk about a 30 years war here soon. And, the Germans always felt like they were treated as second-class citizens. This is something that Hitler will actually play into and use as part of his propaganda, too. Hey, if it worked for Martin Luther, it could work for him. And it certainly did, unfortunately. So, anyway, the Diet of Worms, what were the results? These are things that we need to look at. The Diet of Worms was basically a tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire with the power to outlaw and sentence execution through stake burning. And Charles had promised before his election as Holy Roman Emperor that he would not allow anyone in his empire to be excommunicated unless there was a fair trial. And Germans were okay with that, so they elected him Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles, when he got involved in this whole thing with Luther, went public and said Luther must recant his writings. Luther said, heck no. He said, here I stand. I can do no other. They actually brought him in to this tribunal in front of the emperor, in front of an official from the Catholic Church, And he says, here I stand, I can do no other. He was supposed to repent, and he didn't. So the Edict of Worms was Luther was outlawed as a heretic by the Holy Roman Emperor, and Luther was kidnapped by agents, none other than by Frederick III, and taken to his castle where he was protected, and so they kidnapped him for his own safety.